going to get received. The message that gets received.
You don't think Jay Gruden hears that message? And his coaches don't hear that message?
He's going to get mad if they don't win. That's the message he gets. What your impact in terms of doing is not going to change a single thing.
Jay Gruden cares at all about the booth. Like today,
He does, but I bet you the owner does too.
the owner might. Jay Gruden does, because here's the thing: people are booing on a third down play call that they don't like. Jay Gruden knows more about football and is critical than any of the fans in the crowd. They boo all the time, anytime anything doesn't work.
The owner cares about the empty seats, not about the booth. I'm telling you that right now. That's what they care about. That's what they want to fix.
Yeah, I agree. He cares more about the empty seats a million times over. I do think if you're telling me who's more likely to be in any way influenced by the boos, Dan Snyder 1,000 times over Jay Gruden. Jay Gruden knows that the people in the crowd that are booing him for a third down run play call, here's an example. They pitch it out wide to Chris Thompson on a third and 2 feet. They lose a handful of yards. They lost a handful of yards because they had an offensive lineman screw up in the block.
Not block, but not do the right thing.
Instead of pulling out to clean up the one guy that was there to blow up the play, he blocked down, and the play didn't work, okay? So the feeling in the crowd now is Jay Gruden's an idiot. It's a terrible play call, and how on earth could you toss out wide? And everyone will make fun of that, and they're the smartest guys in the room. When the fact is, the play would have worked just fine if one of the players did their jobs, and instead they didn't. But my point is, Jay Gruden doesn't for 1 second go, oh, these guys are right, we shouldn't have tossed it outside. No, he goes back and watches the film and figures out why it didn't work, and he'll do the same damn thing next time, and hopefully his guy won't completely miss the block.
And listen, and again, I feel like I wasn't too rude to the guy, but the idea that you're going to influence policy based on your vocalizing dissatisfaction in a moment during a week 2 game, I think is beyond naive. Jay Gruden's got way bigger things to worry about. Like, if I don't go to the playoffs this year, I'm probably getting fired. You know what I mean? Like, there's no time he goes, oh, the guy in section 206 was mad at me? Uh-oh.
No way. I think the restaurant analogy works a little bit in general because the point is you don't just say, thank you, may I have another, if the meal is terrible.
Yeah, you just don't go. And that's what I do. There are places that I don't go to because it sucks.
But that said, here is where I think it is a little bit different is I don't know necessarily that you have any role when you go to a restaurant. When you show up and you get that ticket where you are in any way impactful on how the food is going to taste and how quickly it gets to you. Like, if you are not helping the waiter help you, that would be a better comp.
Are you booing mid-meal before the food comes?
Not only that, but I'm saying, like, you have little things you do at a restaurant where you say, hey, when they come over, let's make sure we've got our order together, or whatever.
Yeah.
You can't 3 times when they come over and they say, hey, do you need anything? No, we're just sitting. No, we're just sitting. No, we're just sitting. And then be mad, in other words,
that
they haven't gotten you anything. Right? So my point is, when you're in the crowd, there is an obligation and a role to play. That is to be helpful, not a negative. Do I think you should cheer when they're stinking? Of course not. I'm not stupid. Should you cheer? Go, it's okay, boys. You're down 21-3. This is not tiddlywinks. This is the NFL. It's all right, Alex Smith. Keep checking it down. No. But there's a difference between sitting there frustrated and a throaty boo that everyone on the field can hear, which doesn't help the call. Grant and Danny on the Fan, 800-636-1067. We'll do one more segment on your calls, try to get to as many of you as we can before Craig Hoffman joins us at 1:30.
I got a game for you. It's an unfair game. It's one you can't win. It's called credit card debt. Nowadays, they include a little breakdown to show you how only paying the minimum payments means you'll be paying off that debt for decades. That's right, decades. What's up, Danny Rouillet for Lending Club? You got to go consolidate your debt right now. You can do it. It's very easy to do. You can consolidate your debt or pay off credit cards with one fixed monthly payment. Since 2007, Lending Club has helped millions of people regain control of their finances with affordable, fixed-rate personal loans. No trips to a bank, no high-interest credit cards. Just go to lendingclub.com. Tell them about yourself and how much you want to borrow. Pick the terms that are right for you. And if you're approved, your loan is automatically deposited into your bank account in as little as a few days. Lending Club is the #1 peer-to-peer lending platform with over $35 billion in loans issued. Just go to lendingclub.com/Danny. Check your rate in minutes and borrow up to $40,000. It's that easy. That's lendingclub.com/Danny. Lendingclub.com/Danny. All loans made by WebBank. Member FDIC. Equal housing lender.
The 5th annual Fan Fest is right around the corner. Join us Saturday, September 29th from noon to 3 at the St. James Sports and Active Entertainment Center in Springfield for the biggest Fan Fest ever. Meet Redskins running back Chris Thompson and former Skins Clinton Portis, D'Angelo Hall, and Santana Moss. Sign your child up for a batting clinic featuring former Nationals outfielder Michael Moore.